Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll be exploring what law and order politics amounts to during this moment of spectacular disintegration. I'll be pulling excerpts from David Blacker's What's Left in the World and Carl Freedman's The Age of Nixon, as I attempt to reframe questions of authority, policing, and law and order through both a situationist and Marxist analysis. To put this video in context, let me tell you that over the weekend there was a confrontation between the alt-right Proud Boys and Antifa. The big story that was generated from this confrontation did not revolve around the street battle itself, but instead revolved around an ancillary incident involving an editor for the center-right publication Quillette, who was punched, kicked, given a concussion, and who was briefly hospitalized. Obviously, beating up a non-combatant like Andy No is both wrong in principle and a mistake tactically. In fact, it's a reaction to this event on the left and on the right that is motivating me to produce this video. So let's start with the center-right's reaction.
I think that's the reason that the police don't act. It's not that the police are confused about what needs to happen. We've now seen the result of the mayor's policy, and that result is unacceptable. And is it going to take a death? Is that what it's going to take in order for something to be done? Or can the mayor read the obvious implication of this attack, which is the law has to be enforced against all parties, irrespective of their political beliefs and claims, and that's just simply the nature of a civilized society.
This call for the enforcement of law appears on its face to be fair and maybe even moderate, but it's not. In order to understand the implications of this, I think, naive reaction from Bret Weinstein, let's put this moment into historical context. Let's ask ourselves just what the meaning of a call for law and order is within the context of American political history, and then take a look at the difficulties the police face when tasked with crowd control during mass protests and riots. In his book, The Age of Nixon, Zero Books author Carl Freedman wrote about how the politics of law and order campaigns are illiberal and verge towards authoritarianism. He wrote, "The two components of the term law and order exist, though not in strict logical contradiction to one another, at least in a state of considerable tension. The essence of law is the restraint of brute power, and not only the power of the criminal, but at least equally importantly, the power of the state itself. Law necessarily involves due process, and scrupulous respect for the law must thus include toleration of some possibility of disorder, as in Sir William Blackstone's famous maxim, generally considered foundational to the Anglo-American legal and judicial system, that it is better for 10 guilty defendants to go free than for one innocent defendant to be punished. Conversely, if order is to be the prime value, then there will be times when the repressive illegalities of the crooked cop or the vigilante must be overlooked, excused, or even encouraged. The ideological reality behind the rhetoric of law and order is often the insistence that one must choose law or order." In American history, calls for law and order have almost always been a way, as Freedman frames it, to choose order over law. Back in 1968, when Governor George Wallace ran for president as a law and order candidate for the American Independent Party, he was choosing to support the old order based on segregation and oppression as against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Speaking to a crowd at Madison Square Garden in October of 1968, Wallace said, "Today you cannot even go to the school systems of the large cities of our country without fear. I don't understand it. I remember 6 years ago when this anarchy movement started, Mr. Nixon said, 'It's a great movement.' And Mr. Humphrey said, 'It's a great movement.' Now when they try to speak and are heckled down, they stand up and say, "We've got to have some law and order in this country. They ought to give you law and order back for nothing because they have helped to take it away from you." Today, when President Trump talks about law and order, he too is pitting the legal rights of some people against a perceived order that can be reestablished through force. For instance, the policy of strict enforcement of the law at the border, treatment of refugees and immigrants alike as criminals, and the resulting separation of parents from children and the attendant internment of young kids behind chain-link fences is a predictable result of an attempt to establish law and order as it is usually conceived. Establishing order by making the screening process for people coming over the border more rigorous and strict has meant denying migrants and refugees their rights as established by the United Nations and U.S. law both. The same dynamic can arise in less obvious ways in more ordinary circumstances. For instance, everyday police work and policy operates within this field of tension between law and order. Attempts to strictly enforce the law through policies based on broken windows theory, this idea that evidence of low-level criminality, for instance broken windows, leads to social disorder and increased or more serious crime, trade away legal rights, such as the right to privacy, for the perceived benefit of establishing an ordered and harmonious community. And to return to the example that is most pertinent today, attempts to maintain order and dissuade criminality can clash with fundamental constitutional rights like the right to assemble. Attempts to stop illegal behavior like breaking windows or street fighting can escalate violence and disorder rather than quashing such behavior. The risk is that the police, by enforcing the law too stringently and violently, can undermine their own authority, create resentment in the masses, and in the case of mass protests, unleash an immediate and violent reaction. This is why the police sometimes take a hands-off approach during protests and even riots. For the radical left, however, the concern is not to delicately balance the aim of maintaining legal protections and rights as against the need for social order, but to break with the current order. And this is why some leftist radicals aim their efforts at escalating the tension and increasing the violence. But if the left is going to champion disorder and mass violence, they too should do so while keeping the history of civic unrest and radical struggle in mind. Let's consider an iconic example. According to the Civil Rights Digital Library, the Watts Riot was both the largest and costliest urban rebellion of the Civil Rights era. The riot spurred from an incident on August 11, 1965, when Marquette Fryer, a young African-American motorist, was pulled over and arrested by Lee Minicus, a white California highway patrolman, for suspicion of driving while intoxicated. As a crowd of onlookers gathered at the scene of Fry's arrest, strained tensions between police officers and the crowd erupted in a violent exchange. The outbreak of violence that followed Fry's arrest immediately touched off a large-scale riot centered in the commercial section of Watts. All told, the rioting claimed the lives of 34 people, resulted in more than 1,000 reported injuries, and almost 4,000 arrests, before order was restored on August 17th. Marxist groups at the time, for instance the Los Angeles local SWP, rightly explained the riots by pointing to the history of racism and massive unemployment in Watts. And rather than being the work of a few criminals and gangs, as the police and politicians argued, the SWP reported that over 25,000 residents of Watts participated in the uprising. While the riots have been spontaneous, disorganized, and did not ultimately change the conditions in Watts, the SWP could not but support the riots, as they saw it as a symptom of the contradictions of capitalism becoming obvious. The riots were deemed a step towards a deeper, more organized, more fruitful self-understanding and self-emancipation. The SWP's anti-Bolshevik left enemies, the Situationist International, basically agreed. In a tract released in 1966, Guy Debord wrote, quote, "It is logical to make legal appeals regarding legal questions. What is irrational is to appeal legally against a blatant illegality, as if it was a mere oversight that could be corrected if pointed out. It is obvious that the crude and glaring illegality from which blacks still suffer in many American states has its roots in a socioeconomic contradiction that is not within the scope of existing laws, and that no future judicial law will be able to get rid of this contradiction in the face of the more fundamental laws of this society. What American blacks are really daring to demand is the right to really live, and in the final analysis, this requires nothing less than the total subversion of this society. Why was it that Marxist groups with fundamental ideological differences agreed about the meaning of the Watts riots? Well, let me offer an excerpt from a conservative liberal rather than from a Marxist as an explanation. In Francis Fukuyama's book, The Origins of Political Order, he noted that one of the most important competitive pressures leading to institutional innovation has been violence and wars. That is, it is generally acknowledged that radical violence has, historically at least, been necessary whenever people are attempting to establish substantial political change. But for Marxists, former neoconservatives like Fukuyama, and even a Nazi like Carl Schmitt, violence is generally not the form that power takes once it has been established. Even for Schmitt, for whom all political power rests upon violence, there are other realms such as culture, civilization, economics, morality, law, art, entertainment, and so on. And for the Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek, ordinary or everyday violence is usually a form of impotence. In his book, Violence, Žižek wrote that the difference between radical violence and such outbursts of impotent violence is that an authentic political gesture is active. It imposes, enforces a vision, while outbursts of impotent violence are fundamentally reactive, a reaction to some disturbing intruder. The violence of naive authoritarians like Bret Weinstein and outright cynical authoritarians like Donald Trump is nearly always impotent. The police might appear to be radical, they can seem to impose a vision on the world, but because they are in fact aiming only at maintaining the status quo, their violence often exposes the prevailing order's illegitimacy. After all, if the authority of the prevailing system was legitimate, it wouldn't have to act through violence. It would act through something else like law or culture. Likewise, the violence of the mob can also be transformed into mere impotent violence. The young men and women who beat up Andy Ngo, for example, did not do so with the aim of creating something new. They did not justify their violent authority upon the strength of a rising order or a new set of laws or economic relations, but attempted to excuse it as a kind of self-defense. Without an organized and disciplined political forum, these masked street fighters, armed with milkshakes, silly string, and clenched fists, never arrive at the radical position they desire. This is truly unfortunate, as social transformation and the development of a new order is, according to Zero Book's author David Blacker, desperately needed. In his book, What's Left in the World, he explains our current political moment, this moment of liquid modernity, by quoting Antonio Gramsci, who wrote, quote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. It seems to me that members of the intellectual dark web like Bret Weinstein, populist reactionaries like Donald Trump, and all the Proud Boys and Patriots are precisely the morbid symptoms of our current crisis. If we on the left want to transcend this moment, if we aim to do something more than become mere symptoms ourselves, we'll have to make sure that whatever violence may emerge leads to a new order. As the situationist Guy Debord once wrote, those who want to overcome the old established order in all its aspects cannot attach themselves to the disorder of the present, even in the sphere of culture. Victory will be for those who will be able to create disorder without loving it. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.